Okay, in this unit we will be covering the development of Athens, and we'll be looking at some key moments in the evolution towards the creation in Athens of a democratic form of government. So we'll begin with the Archaic period, actually a little bit uh, before the Archaic period, and we'll run all the way through the development of the democratic form of government that Athens is perhaps most known for. So right away, a lay of the land. I want you guys to understand the proximity of Sparta to Athens, and the fact that, as we've looked at in the previous video lecture, Sparta will dominate the peninsula known as the Peloponnesus. Athens will dominate the peninsula known as the Attic Peninsula or Attica. And this sets these two poleis apart, Sparta and Athens. Will be territorially and population-wise the largest of the Greek poleis. And of course, at times they will be allies and at times they will be rivals. And it will be a really interesting relationship nonetheless. So, as I mentioned, when we're looking about space, Athens is one of the larger poleis, controlling about 1,000 square miles of the Attic Peninsula. And of course, the way the city-states worked was you would have kind of an urban center, if I can use that word, in the ancient equivalent of an urban center, and surrounded by farmland. And of course, being a peninsula, Athens is going to be surrounded by water also, at least on three sides. And unlike the Spartans, the Athenians will grow comfortable in taking to the sea. And this will be one of the characteristics that will define them. And as mentioned in a previous video lecture, those Greeks that will settle in that area, which is now coastal Turkey, that area known as Ionia, uh, many of them will have close relationships to Athens. Athens will send out some of its people to Ionia, and that will be instrumental in a later development when we begin to look at the Greeks and the Persians being drawn into conflict with one another, what those Greeks in Ionia have to do with it, and their relationship with the Athenians. Now, in order to control such a vast space in relative terms, the Athenians had to undergo a process that many of the larger city-states underwent, and this is the process of synoikism, or the bringing together, in which the main villages located in where the city of Athens was uh, will lead a unification effort to bring all the Greeks in a certain area together as a political unit. And we think that somewhere between the ninth century and the 7th century BCE, this process of Synoikism, or the bringing together, the unification, occurred. Now, for the Athenians themselves, they attribute this process to their great hero Theseus, who was, of course, known mythologically as the killer of the Minotaur. And we will see how Theseus pops up time and again as kind of this figure to be revered by the Athenians, and how he is the kind of the guiding spirit of Athenian beliefs in how they should interact with their fellow Greeks and with the broader world around them. Now, politically, in the Archaic Age, we believe that that Athens was at one time governed by a king, but as time went by, the king lost power and was replaced by officials that were called archons. And the archons, initially, it would be one archon, but as time went on, the number of archons broadened out until, and I give you some specifics here, but because it's in black text, you're not going to have to really latch on to each of these terms. But what I want you to know is that by the time we get into the late 7th century, we're looking at 9 archons as a type of governing body. And of course, each of these archons would come from noble families, and noble families being defined as, some of the early founding members when the Synoikism occurred, whenever it did occur. Those families that were most prominent retained their status through the generations. And these are the families that would supply the archons that would govern Athens. Now, interesting development around 683, an archon being limited to only 1 year in office. And the idea being that this should be a revolving position and that you have to kind of share the status amongst the various competing noble families. So archons serving for a year, and then it's not like they go away into private life. They retain a political role for the rest of their lives by becoming lifetime members of a council called the Areopagus. This council of the Areopagus, Areopagus is the hill of Ares, where the chamber where this council met. So it becomes known by its geographical location, the Areopagus. And the former archons, once you serve your year, you retire, if you will, into this Areopagus Council, and you will advise the current archons. And the Romans, for those of you guys familiar with Roman history, during the Republic period of Roman history, the Romans will have an elected office, the consul. There will be 2 consuls that serve every year. And then when your year is up, you now become eligible to sit in a permanent body called the Senate. So, the Athenians pioneered this type of system. Now, there is some debate as to, how did you get to become an archon? Who elected you or appointed you for your 1 year? And the working theory now is that the archons probably elected by a broader assembly called the ecclesia, and this would consist of all adult male citizens. So even those of lower socioeconomic status could have a political function in electing, or at least in part taking place in an electoral process by which archons would be selected annually. Now, some pivotal moments that are going to occur. And the first one that Martin mentions and that we should be aware of is in around the year 632 BCE, an Athenian aristocrat, one of the Aristoi, who also happened to have won an Olympic victory. I think he won at the chariot races. His name was Chilon. Chilon attempts to seize soul power and set up what becomes known as a tyranny in Athens. And the attempt will fail, but this gives me a moment in this lecture to talk about tyranny as a political topic that we will revisit time and time again, because it was relatively common that you would have this type of situation occur in the various Greek polis. Now, the word tyrannos or tyranny is not, it was a lot more innocuous than it is today. When we think of tyrant, we think of people, like Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein, etc. Pick your bad guy. But for the Greeks, the word merely indicated that you had somebody who was ruling, again, as a sole ruler, as a single ruler, and had gotten into this position through some unorthodox or irregular means. There was no electoral process involved, or he wasn't a king who was born into the role. He got there somehow by maneuvering, political maneuvering. And the way that it usually occurred was, and here I'm going to kind of digress into the whole tyrant phenomenon, but the way it would occur is that in an oligarchy in which you have a limited number of noble families, aristoi, trying to compete with one another for greater status, prestige, power, etc., you're going to get exceptionally ambitious members of certain families who will decide, this competition is self-defeating and we've got some problems that we need to deal with. and this competition is hindering us from effectively governing our city-state. So one of these aristoi eventually is going to reach out to non-nobles. And when we see the emergence of a hoplite class, this becomes a constituency that you, if you are an ambitious aristoi, can make an alliance with, basically promising this lower class that, hey, look, I feel your pain, I hear about your problems, I will take care of you if you support me politically and, if necessary, militarily. You know, you got to have my back. You got to supply me with some muscle if push comes to shove. But if you support my effort to become a tyrant, to rule as an individual, as a single leader of this polis, then I will look out for your interests and I will help you out. And this is the way that it usually worked. So the hoplite class becomes kind of the key demographic to ally yourself with if you are an exceptionally ambitious member of the nobility. Okay, now back to Kylon. His attempt fails, and there's some dispute as to what happens to Kylon, but some violence, some blood was shed. Herodotus says that Kylon and those that supported him were killed. There's a big scandal surrounding the means by which they were killed. They had applied for sanctuary at one of the temples, and they were told, okay, you guys can leave peacefully. And then when they left the temple, they were killed. I don't want to go down that road because I want to keep this lecture relatively brief. But anyway, Kylon's attempt failed, but it's like anything else. Once you see somebody do something, maybe you get ideas as to, geez, I could have maybe pulled this off if I had done something a little differently. So Kylon sets a precedent, and we will see another run at tyranny in Athens in a moment. Well, the other Aristoi, recognizing that Kylon's attempt is a red flag. Kylon's attempt to set up a tyranny is a red flag, and maybe we need to do something to equalize our society because Kylon's attempt at tyranny failed because the hoplite class did not rally to him. And to prevent future tyrants from emerging and to maybe satisfy the hoplite class, providing them with a measure of at least legal equality, get the laws written down, codify a law code, something that had not yet been done in Athens, in which people feel like they're going to be treated equally. Write it down, post it everywhere, so there is at least the symbolism of fairness, legal fairness, and maybe that will short circuit any attempt of future tyrannies. Now, the guy chosen to write the law code is a guy named Draco. And whether or not he actually existed is still open to debate. Draco translates from the Greek as serpent or snake, and that right away is a signal to us that maybe he was not a real person, but one of these mythical figures who was believed to have done great deeds. Well, the thing you need to remember about Draco's law code is that it was a very harsh code. Everything was punishable by death. And in a way, Draco succeeds in establishing this type of equality under the law. If anybody steps out of line, then they will be executed. But of course, living under such a law code gets old, and this is not going to address what we'll look at in the next slide, the major problem, which of course is socioeconomic. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer in the 600s, and that is a situation that could lead to tyranny or worse, civil war. So we get the term draconian from this effort by this person or myth, Draco, to establish a law code, but it really does not work. Now, the potential for explosion, and here we see that between 625 and 600, the agrarian crisis that had been seething for some time grows acute. We see the uh, development in Athens of stasis. And stasis is again one of those phenomenon that we are going to revisit time and again because it never goes away. I mean, you can argue that it is with us today in 21st century America and other societies where you have perceived inequalities between the rich and the poor, perceived or actual inequalities between the rich and the poor. So the Greeks actually had a term for this kind of class conflict, and they called it stasis. And for the Athenians, the stasis grows potentially explosive again in this time frame. What happens is, as you can well imagine, the wealthy aristoi are controlling a lot of the land, a lot of the best land, the most fertile land, and Attica, quite frankly, is not a very fertile place if you are thinking about growing crops. The Aristoi also had the land and the resources to begin growing olive trees and vineyards, growing the grape. And these were much sought after products in the broader Mediterranean. Greek olives and all the products you can make from it, olive oil, were a favored export amongst the Greek city-states. So you have this situation where the wealthy Aristoi have got the richest farmland. They can grow wheat. They can grow these other products. They can have a diverse product line. Whereas the poorer farmers are barely scratching out a living. Often, the quality of the soil is poor, and they're relegated to trying to grow wheat. And we have this situation where the wealthy Aristoi are exporting their olives and their wine, their grapes, etc., and are trading it for wheat that they can bring back and sell on the market cheaper than the poorer farmers can grow at home. Now, what exacerbates the situation and makes it especially dangerous is that there was a system in Athens at the time where the poorer farmers, if they needed a loan, there were no banks, so they would go to the wealthy Aristoi and get the resources, the seed, or the means to plant for another season. But of course, farming is a very risky proposition, and if something happened and the harvest failed, and the Athenian farmers could not pay back the debt that they owed to the wealthy Aristoi, there was a feature that allowed them, as a type of collateral, to put their children and their wives up as collateral. And if the harvest failed and they could not pay back the debt, they would basically have to give their children, then their wives, and probably themselves into a type of debt slavery that we can imagine as a type of indentured servitude where you work for free. You work off your debt at the estate of these wealthy Aristoi. So you can see that this is a potentially explosive situation and something must be done. And fortunately for the Athenians, the archons at the time and the members of the Areopagus recognize that we have a dangerous situation and we need to do something. Enter the guy who's going to potentially save Athens from civil war. And the guy is named Solon, and he was an actual person. We know this because he left a written record of his reforms in the form of poetry. He was also a poet. So, in a very unusual move indicating the seriousness of the situation, for the year 594-593 BCE, the Areopagus gives Solon full power to do whatever he thinks he needs to do to reform the Athenian government and head off the stasis that is growing in Athenian society. So Solon becomes a type of dictator, a type of tyrant, legal tyrant, the idea being he's got 1 year and then he has to step down from power. So Solon goes to work right away. And the two things I'd like you to remember about his reforms is the first is what we call the Sisaktheia. And translated, this means the shaking off of burdens or the shaking off of debts. And this becomes a type of debt forgiveness policy. Those that had been sold into this type of debt slavery that were indentured servants, they no longer have to do that. The debts are canceled. And this is a way to alleviate the most dangerous part of the crisis. So the Sisaktheia, the shaking off of the debts. And the here you see in yellow, I've given you an actual verse from Solon in which he's describing what he did to balance out both sides, one against the other. And he gives to the people, I gave as many privileges as belong to them, neither taking away their honor nor overextending it. And what this means is there may have been some call for land reform by breaking up the larger estates of the nobles and giving some of that better land to the poorer people so that they could become self-sufficient, but he did not do that. So his reforms only go so far. No land reform. And those who had power and were magnificent due to wealth, I saw to it that they had nothing shameful. All right, so again, he's not going to strip away from them their land or their privileges. And he considers himself a powerful shield in not permitting either to claim an unjust victory. So again, limited reforms to head off crisis. Now the Sisaktheia is only one. The second and more far-reaching of his reforms is to create four classes of citizen based on wealth, and this is key. The Aristoi were made up of families that from their earliest roots were considered noble, and they had a lock on political power. What Solon does is saying, no, no, no. We need to make this governing process more flexible, and we need to bring in more people. And in order to do that, we have to have a more flexible measure as to who should rule and what status should be based on. So he makes wealth, not birth, the measure of what socioeconomic category and therefore what political category you will belong to. So the four categories here, the first are going to be the wealthiest. They are the Pentacosio Medemnoi. Try saying that 3 times fast. The Pentacosio Medemnoi, their estates, their property could yield roughly 500 or more bushels of produce in a season, in a growing season. And these are going to be the wealthy landowners who are already established. The next category are the Hippies. These are the people whose land can yield this much produce. And generally speaking, Hippies indicates that they had enough wealth to afford at least one horse. And of course, horses were a type of conspicuous consumption item. They're like a Jaguar or a Porsche today. If you can afford a horse, this is before the type of harness was not available where horses could be used on the farm to plow. You had to use oxen for that. So horses are something to get around in. It's like having, again, a sports car, indicating how wealthy you are. The third category are the Zygotoi. And these are going to be the hoplite class. And if you have this much wealth, between 300 and 200 bushels, you could afford a pair of oxen that you would use to plow your land. So Zygotoi had enough wealth to afford at least 2 oxen. And the last class, the poorest of the poor, were the Thetes. And they are basically laborers or subsistence farmers. They have very little in the way of material possessions. Now, again, the idea is that, if you were savvy and smart and worked hard, perhaps your wealth could increase and you could one day make your way up the socioeconomic chain. And if you were foolish and irresponsible, you could also make your way down the chain. So there is now a flexible measure of what class you belong to. And Solon ties this into politics by basically saying if you belong to the 2 wealthiest classes, you are allowed to serve on the Areopagus. Okay, and chances are you would be the archons. Now this third class, the Zygotai class, could serve on an elected council of 400. This is a new innovation that Solon will help create. And we can imagine this today when we look at our own bicameral legislature. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. Well, we can see a type of Senate here and a type of House of Representatives here. Now the Thetes, the poorest, could participate in an assembly which voted on issues brought to it by the Council of 400. So even for the Thetes, there is now a political role. It is very limited. Thetes cannot hold any kind of office, but they can basically raise their hand voting yes or no on certain issues that the Council of 400 will bring before it. Uh, so Solon, after enacting his reforms, he decides he's taken off for 10 years. The idea being that no changes could be made to Solon's reforms unless he was consulted first. So he knows that these type of reforms are going to have to take some time before they are really prove their worth. So he takes off for 10 years, wants to let the reforms work their way into the Athenian psyche. And one of his interesting journeys, according to Herodotus, who you will start reading in this unit, is that he visits King Croesus of Lydia, and there's a very interesting discussion he has with Croesus of Lydia that you will be reading about, and that will pop up in one of your writing assignments a little later on. That's in Book 1, 129 to 133. So those are Solon's reforms. Now, when Solon leaves, things don't really get any better. There is some relief for a while, but the same old issues begin to creep up. The poor are still poor, and the rich are still rich. And that ultimately will lead to tyranny being established at Athens in the form of an aristoi, a nobleman, called Pisistratus, who actually takes 3 stabs at it before he finally succeeds in becoming tyrant of Athens. This image that you see here refers to a story Herodotus tells us. This is his second attempt at tyranny, where he tries once, gets bounced out of Athens, returns, and on his way into the city of Athens, he sees this very tall, statuesque farm girl, and he dresses her up like the goddess Athena, who is the patron goddess of Athens. And he comes riding in with a chariot, a lot of fanfare, and he claims that Athena has blessed his attempt to become the sole ruler of Athens. And that does not really work. It takes him another stab at the effort until he finally becomes tyrant in the year 546. And the way that Pisistratus became tyrant is kind of the obvious way, given the broader socio-economic problems plaguing Athens. Pisistratus reaches out to the hoplite class and to the poorer farmers and basically says, guys, if you support me, I will guarantee your lives will get better. And they say, well, we've got nothing to lose. Let's support this guy. And so in 546, Pisistratus is tyrant. And he makes good on his word. By all accounts, Pisistratus was a very benevolent ruler. And I want you to key in on these specific reforms that he introduced. He basically initiates the first tax in Athens, taxing agricultural produce. And he uses that money in 2 ways: to fund public works projects, and this is meant to help those thetes, the poorest of the poor who own no property. All they can sell is their labor. Well, he puts them to work, and he pays them a wage. I mean, this is kind of like Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal back during the Great Depression. And he also will use some of that tax revenue to give the middling farmers low-interest loans so that they can, or actually interest-free loans, so that they can get a better jump on things and maybe broaden out their own agricultural produce by getting olive trees and other types of products that they can then export abroad and become a lot more prosperous than they have in the past. So Pisistratus is going to be tyrant for about 20 years, and in that time, he's going to do a lot to help out, again, the lower 2 classes of Athenian society. Now, he's so well respected, so well regarded, that when he does die, the tyranny is going to be granted to his eldest son, Hippias. And Hippias is going to be advised and assisted by his younger brother Hipparchus. So the two sons of Pisistratus are going to have a lead role in governing Athens after he is dead, and that is a true measure as to how well respected Pisistratus must have been. But now things get ugly. Hipparchus, the younger brother, gets involved in a love triangle. He is in love with the most beautiful youth, supposedly, in Athens, a young man named Harmodius. And Harmodius already has a lover named Aristogeiton. And Hipparchus making moves against Harmodius, the two lovers, Aristogeiton and Harmodius, decide to assassinate Hipparchus. And they do. At a very public occasion, one of the Athenian festivals, they kill him publicly, and they are arrested, and ultimately both will be executed. But the effect it has on Hippias is to turn him into a real tyrant. He will round up mass arrests. He believes it's a broader conspiracy against his family, against himself, and he really becomes hated by arresting and torturing Athenian citizens. So in 508, the Athenian people, I'm skipping through a lot of dramatic events in the 6 years from 514 to 508, but the end result is that by 508, the Athenians have overthrown Hippias, and an Athenian nobleman named Cleisthenes will, through, let's just say, not through altruism, but maybe through this idea of ultimately benefiting Cleisthenes. It doesn't work out that way, but he will help them. He will help the Athenian people build the world's first functional democracy. Democracy from the Greek demos krateia, the rule of the people. And what Cleisthenes will do, he will lay down many reforms. I will cover some of the highlights here. But Cleisthenes is savvy enough to know that he has got to solve this problem of stasis, this self-destructive feuding that could lead to future tyranny or worse, civil war. So Cleisthenes is a very clever man, does something radical. He reorganizes Athenian society, which had been based on 4 tribes. And these tribes were all going to be uh, controlled by certain families, certain noble families. And what Cleisthenes does is decide to broaden out the field a little bit and break the monopoly of power by the older, more established Aristoi families. He creates 10 new groups, 10 new tribes, if you will, called phylae. Okay, and the phylae are going to be created, very important creation process here. In order to break up the regional influence of certain noble families, the phylae are going to be made up of a broad spectrum of areas of Athens. And what I mean by that is Cleisthenes is going to take the 139 what are called the demes. These are villages or neighborhoods of Athens, and he's going to take these 139 entities, these demes, and he's going to group them into 30 trities. And the trities themselves are going to be arranged according to region, and they're basically 3 distinct regions that Cleisthenes will build his trities on: city, coast, or what we could call the rural or inland areas. And this map gives you a sense of how this would look. Now, this map of Athens is divided into 30 different sections. Now, the colors indicate the regions. The dark yellow indicates the coastal areas. Those areas that are, and I'm going to include this one here, those areas that somehow are on the coast. Okay? And the city is going to be these areas here. And of course, that leaves the rural or inland trities here. And each of his 10 phylae is going to have to include one triti from the coast. Let me use another color. one from the rural areas and one from the urban area. So each fillet has got to have a broad spectrum of population. You're going to have some coastal people who make their living, say, by fishing. They're fishermen. You got the farmers represented in the rural area and the urban area. You've got those urban kind of, blacksmiths and potters and things like that. So people who ordinarily wouldn't have anything to do with one another are now going to have to work together. They're going to have to find a shared interest because they are now in the same tribe or file. File is singular, fillet represents the 10 in a plural sense. So very interesting way of reorganizing. And of course, when you do it this way, you break the power of the noble families who generally dominate, say, one area geographically. Well, now some of their people some of their former loyalists are going to have to belong to one file. The others are going to have to belong to another file. So this is a way that Cleisthenes prevents stasis from reoccurring in Athens. Now, the Athenian democracy is going to be what we refer to as a direct democracy, and the main lawmaking body is going to be the assembly. And when we talk about the number of citizens involved on a day-to-day basis in the democracy, we're looking at 40,000. They are adult males, and they have been born within the city, and they each have one vote. Now, this assembly would be called to meet 40 times a year, and they would have to devote time to listening to propositions being put forth and debating issues, and ultimately voting on certain issues, whether it would be declarations of war or levying a tax, whatever. Now, the assembly had a certain meeting place. It was called the Pnyx, and this image shows you the Pnyx. It was kind of this rocky area that could comfortably hold about 6,000. Because we have to imagine that although there are 40,000 citizens in Attica, not everybody is going to be able to show up 40 times a year, travel in some cases a very considerable distance to get to Athens. You're going to have this idea of that not everybody's going to show up at the same time. But quorum is established at 6,000. So the idea is that as long as 6,000 people show up during these 40 times per year assemblies, then we can do business. Now, to make things run smoothly during those 40 times a year when the assembly meets, each of the 10 filii will have to select 50 citizens, and they will serve on a 500-member council called the Boule. And it is the Boule's job to get into Athens prior to the assembly meeting and to set an agenda so that when you get all these people coming in from the countryside, from the coastal areas, there's an agenda that is set and business can be conducted as efficiently as possible. I mean, otherwise you would not have a functional democracy, you would have chaos. So this is kind of the key linchpin, but note, this is only a temporary office. And that becomes a key cornerstone, this idea that, yeah, you ought to do your duty, your civic duty, you ought to serve in various offices, but don't get too comfortable in positions of power. And for those that did perhaps want to attain more power, uh, one of the ways that Cleisthenes is going to come up with heading off any potential tyrannies developing in the future was to create a process called ostracism. And the way it would work is that at every assembly, the last point on the agenda would be, okay, so the next time we meet, does anybody want to hold an ostracism? And what they're actually asking is, are you fearful that one of us, one of the Athenian citizens, is growing too lustful for power and is becoming a danger to the democracy? If you believe such a person exists, let's hold an ostracism at the next assembly, and this person could be then dealt with. And the way that it would work is, well, when the next assembly rolls around, one of the things on the agenda is that each citizen gets a shard of pottery called an ostraka, And here we have some recovered shards. And if you believed somebody was growing too dangerous, you would scratch their name on this pottery shard and put it in a bucket. And the buckets would then be dumped out, and the person whose name appeared most, okay, even if you had your name appeared and you had 100 votes, and everybody else only had 80 or 90, well, you were the top vote getter in a negative sense. You would then be forced to leave Athens for 10 years, okay, because you were then deemed kind of a public threat. Now, your property would not be touched. You could come back in 10 years, and you could then pick up where you left off. But if at least 6,000 citizens cast their ostraka, the person whose name appeared most would then be bumped out of Athens for 10 years. So this becomes a type of safety valve to prevent a tyranny from occurring again. And we'll see some very high profile ostracism do occur at key moments in Athenian history. And so I leave you now with the kind of the physical geography of Athens. This is the Areopagus that I mentioned, that council. This is the Pnyx, that rocky area where the assembly would meet. Up here is the Acropolis. The Parthenon has not yet been built, but when it does get built, it's going to appear here. Here is the Bouleuterion, where that council, the Boule, works to set the agenda for the incoming assembly, and other various structures that we'll look at in future lectures.